Welcome to Locked Up for Profit, a Google Hangout brought to you by the American Friends Service Committee. I'm Alexis Moore, Media Relations Director for AFSC. The federal government has established a quota of 34,000 immigrant detention center beds to be filled every day. That's 34,000 beds. That quota ensures revenue for the for-profit companies that run many of the detention centers. But the cost to the rest of us is extraordinary. Devastated families and communities, erosion of trust in local law enforcement, and constitutional rights imperiled. The bed quota is one of many examples of how corporations are influencing public policy to increase profits, resulting in increased militarization of our society instead of prioritizing human needs. Today we'll discuss how current immigration policies affect families, how corporations shape those policies, and how communities are organizing against for-profit prisons and detention centers. Let me introduce Gabriela Flora, Immigrant Rights Program Director in Denver, Colorado, who works with families directly affected by detention and deportation.
It's great to be with you all today.
Leah Lindsay is Policy Impact Coordinator in AFSC's office in Washington. Hi, Leah.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Alexis.
And Matthew Lowen is Associate Program Director in Tucson, where he is part of organizing a campaign to stop the growth of private prisons and detention centers. Hi, Matt.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Please join our conversation by sending questions or comments in the chat box on your screen, or send to questions@AFSC, or via Twitter by mentioning AFSC_org. And please let us know where you are joining us from. We're interested in your community. We're going to start with Gabriela. Gabriela, tell us what you have seen working with families affected by detention and deportation, and also by the vigils you participate in outside of the detention center run by GEO, one of the largest for-profit prison companies.
Thank you, Alexis. First of all, I want to be clear that while the GEO Corporation, which is a for-profit corporation center in Aurora, and all other for-profit facilities are called detention centers, they are prison-like conditions. People do not have freedom of movement. If a guard does not like something that someone's doing, we hear many stories of people being thrown into solitary confinement. When a family member or friend comes to visit, they visit the detainee through glass. And because it is a detention center related to immigration, if someone has a family member who is undocumented, they are unable, it's unsafe for them to go visit them. So things that we find are, how do people get into the system? I think that's something people often don't know about, ways families are brought in. So often it is simply through going about daily life. I want to share some stories with you of people that we work with. Lupe and Abel, 2 years ago, were traveling 8 miles over the speed limit on the highway. They were pulled over and they were brought directly into the GEO detention facility. They have 4 citizen children. Those 4 children for 4 days did not know where they were. They were not sure whether their parents were alive or not, and there's been obviously a lot of fear and trauma for the family because of that. People are often also brought in because of previous convictions. Felipe is someone we have worked with for several years. He, after 20 years after a drug offense, he had a fender bender and was brought to the attention of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and he was brought into the GEO detention facility, and he spent 16 months there. He was actually transferred back and forth between several different facilities throughout the country without knowing beforehand that he was going to be moved. Again, this was a conviction of over 20 years ago. And this is part of, I think it's really important to understand that in 1996, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, which is called IRA, meant that it retroactively expanded criminal grounds for deportation. That means that people who had convictions even prior to the passage of this law, and including folks who were even legal permanent residents, not just undocumented folks, and in some cases even citizens, could be brought into detention and be potentially deported. Here in Colorado, we have two brothers, the Venezuelan brothers, and they are both Vietnam vets, and they had criminal convictions in the 1970s, and they have been fighting their deportation cases. So this has real implications for real people. I think it's also important to note that Obama has talked about the fact that Immigration and Customs Enforcement should go after felons, not families. Well, our office works with people who have previous felony convictions, and we know that they have families, and we believe that deportation is not okay. In these cases where people have already served time for convictions, deportation serves as a second and in many cases often more severe sentence. So
let's explain a little bit about the impact on the family and the community when these kinds of situations happen.
Yeah, and I want to point out that these kinds of situations happen continuously. We have 1,000 people per day that are deported from this country, and thousands who are brought into detention and deportation. And these have huge impacts on families, communities, our economy, and our social fabric. I want to give the example of Arturo Hernandez. He is fighting his case for over 4 years now, and AFSC has been accompanying him in sanctuary. He is actually in a church because he had reached his final order of deportation, and community and congregations are keeping him in a safe space there while he's fighting his case and highlighting the inhumanity of these types of policies. He owns a flooring business. He has employed over 9 people in his business and has been very successful at it. Being stuck in the church while he's in sanctuary means that his business has been impacted and has been hurt. And this hurts our local economy, and it hurts those other families who would potentially be employed by Arturo. His 15-year-old daughter, Maria Elena, and his 9-year-old daughter have been severely impacted by this. They're incredible children with incredible strength who are out there at all the vigils and all of the rallies in support of his father, but it's had big implications for them. Arturo's wife, Ana, has gone to work for the first time because their family has been really struggling to pay all of their bills. I think that in addition to the major, huge stressors that people have around the economic and really trauma they have, it's also, Arturo speaks about how he just misses the daily parts of life. He misses being able to come home after a really hard day's work where he's tired, to put his feet up and be in the living room hanging out with his daughters where they're doing their homework. And these basic things that we take for granted become huge obstacles for people who confront detention and deportation. Lupe and Abel have 4 citizen children, and their ages are 8, 10, 11, and 13. And like I said, they didn't know for 4 days whether their parents were alive or not. And there is still trauma the children experience. In fact, when they were just in our office yesterday for a meeting, and Kimberly and Wendy always draw pictures, and they are often pictures of their parents being taken away by police. And it's so powerful to have an 8-year-old little girl draw this picture of tears coming down her and her 3 siblings' eyes and her parents' eyes as they're being taken away by the police. And her writing about this and saying, this isn't just happening to my family, it's happening to other families.
I'm going to stop you there. We are going to put up links for more information about the situations that Gabriela is discussing, especially the situation with Arturo in sanctuary. But we have a question here from Ivan in Los Angeles. He asks, I thought that the laws could not be enforced ex post facto. What about that?
Well, again, with the 1996 law I referred to, it actually is being enforced retroactively. It was designed to do that. And again, that was the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. So it seems like that should be contrary to our Constitution, but it is happening on a daily basis throughout this country.
And this is the United States, where presumption of innocence is the foundation of the justice system, allegedly. I'm going to switch to Leah now to hopefully answer a couple of questions we've already gotten. Leah, how many detention centers are run by for-profit companies, and how much does the federal government spend detaining immigrants?
Great, thank you. So I'll take the first part of that question first. There are approximately nationwide 250 immigration detention facilities, 30 of which are privately owned and or operated. And approximately 72% are privately contracted to GEO Group, which was mentioned earlier, and CCA, which is Corrections Corporation of America. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but getting to the second part of your question in terms of how much does the government spend on detention, it's astronomical. Every year, the U.S. spends about $2 billion, with a B, billion, to detain around 440,000 immigrants. That translates into approximately $164 per day per immigrant detainee. And when we look at the detention facilities and where this money goes, I think it's helpful to know that the detention facilities are sometimes privately operated, sometimes they're operated by the federal government, sometimes they're operated by state and local governments. And when we look to private entities that are profiteering on this, in 2013, Corrections Corporation of America collected around $206 million from ICE contracts, which is approximately 12% of their revenue. And under the same parameters with contracts with ICE, GEO collected about $255 million, or 17% of its 2012 revenue. So these are very big numbers.
Let's talk about the dots here. Let's connect some dots here. If taxpayers spend that kind of money, they probably aren't quite sure how it got to this number. How does the money poured into lobbying tie into all of this?
Great question. So I think it's helpful to lead here with a statement actually made by GEO Group in 2013, where they said, quote, "Immigration reform laws, which are currently a focus for legislators and politicians at the federal, state, and local level, could materially adversely impact us." So these companies exist to make money for their shareholders. That's just how businesses operate. And so their bread and butter, as we heard earlier, given the percentage of their revenue generated from governments with or contracts with ICE, is substantial. So for them, more people behind bars means more money for them. For-profit companies see enormous financial growth when federal policies increase the number of immigrants in detention.
This is to point out here, it is not simply immigrant detention where corporations are benefiting from public policy. Governing under the influence is the name of a project we're working on to highlight not only in immigration, not only in criminal justice, but in the military industrial complex, as they call it. We will talk about that a little bit more later. Thank you for that clarity, Leah. Matt, let's turn to you. What in Arizona, activists have been waging a very vigorous campaign against for-profit prisons and privatized services in state-run prisons. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. So in Arizona, we have been confronting for-profit private prison companies for years, and there's kind of three specific ways that we've been doing that. We have been using research and documentation to expose the faulty logic that the private prison industry uses. So for example, we published Private Prisons, the Public's Problem, which is a cost comparison between public and private prisons in Arizona. And more recently, we published Death Yards, which is about the spike in deaths in the Arizona prisons following the privatization of the health care for prisoners, which is still ongoing. Both of those can be found online on our website, and I think links are going to be put up. Secondly, we also have been putting pressure on public officials, both state and federal, to come out against private prisons or to step down from their participation in actions that profit off criminalization and prison profiteering. Last year, an example is we celebrated when former U.S. Senator Dennis DeConcini stepped down from his position of the Board of Directors for Corrections Corporation of America. That had been an ongoing campaign that we had. DeConcini lives here in Tucson. and is very involved with a lot of different issues, and we felt that it was extremely important for him to not be making money off of immigrants being placed into private detention facilities. And then thirdly, and this is an ongoing project, we've been organizing the community against criminalization, specifically Operation Streamline. So Operation Streamline takes place here in Tucson in the federal court, and it is the daily en masse criminalization of up to 70 immigrants in the plea hearing that is called Operation Streamline. And so what Operation Streamline does is when people get caught up in with ICE and Border Patrol, instead of simply deporting them, as has been the practice, they now are given criminal sentences and have to spend anywhere from 30 to 180 days in a federal detention facility, many of which are private.
Let me stop you there. Let me stop you there very quickly. My understanding is that until recently, people were detained as civil offenses for not having papers, as opposed to criminalizing them and being incarcerated. But my understanding is, from what you're saying, there is not a stop at civil citation anywhere. Is that right?
It depends. I mean, that can happen, but with Operation Streamline and other criminalizing practices, they're treating it criminally instead of civilly. So you're exactly right.
My further understanding is that now the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol refers more cases for federal criminal prosecution than the FBI. Can that actually be the case? Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding. I don't know the exact numbers for that, but what we do know for sure is that the federal courts are being overwhelmed with criminal prosecution of immigrants as opposed to other cases.
So that means instead of, let's say, drug dealers and or weapons smugglers, we're worrying about people who might have gotten stopped because their license expired.
Yeah, or they simply are trying to cross the border to be with their families where they've been for decades.
What a shame. What a shame. We have a question, and let me remind you, please send your questions to the chat box or to questions@afsc.org. We have a question concerning what seems to be a bipartisan effort, a surprising advocacy of criminal justice reform from people on the right. And the question is, do we encourage this? My understanding is, and Leah, you need to answer this, my understanding is that there are different bills that are emerging in the Senate, but none of them actually touch on what we're discussing now. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. So there are a couple different bills that speak to sentencing reform, so the Smarter Sentencing Act, and there's a bill currently moving forward that deals with reducing mass incarceration and mandatory minimums. So right now the legislation that we're seeing mainly has to do with reducing the prison population, not necessarily the type of prison or the prison conditions or human rights abuses that may be occurring in those facilities.
Well, considering the United States holds more people in its prisons than any of the industrial world, it probably would be a good idea to rethink that. I'm going to switch back to Matt very quickly. Matt, what advice would you give people who are also faced with for-profit prisons in their communities and do not want them there?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and Leah's answer to the previous question kind of brings that up, that politicians are finally talking about mass incarceration, and that's, I think, a really critical point. And whether or not we agree or disagree in the way that they're talking about it, the conversation has shifted, and we're now talking about for-profit private prison industry as a driver of continued mass incarceration and criminalization, both at the state, federal, and immigration levels. And we need to keep that momentum going. We need to write letters. We need to attend and participate in public forums. We need to ask our public officials to take public stances on prison profiteering, against prison profiteering, and the criminalization of our communities. And we need to also remember that ending prison privatization or profiting off of incarceration is only one piece in a larger puzzle about ending criminalization of people in our communities. Also, if a private prison is proposed in your community or your neighborhood, there are often public hearings where you can participate in and speak about those proposals and oppose, and those are critical moments that you can really have some power in. And AFSC has both experience and tools to help people effectively organize around those issues. People can contact our office in Arizona or other AFSC offices that might be closer to them.
Please check our website, afsc.org. Apropos of your comment, we have a question from Nancy. I will meet Democratic presidential hopeful Martin O'Malley in about an hour at a house party. What detention question would you like me to ask him? I'm going to let you start, Matt, and then we'll go to Leah and Gabriella.
I would ask him, what does he propose to do to limit the number of detentions and deportations? And that should happen immediately.
All right. Okay. Go ahead, Leah. What do you think?
I think it's important to ask him if he's familiar with the bed quota policy, which I can discuss later on, and its relationship to profiteering. It's an arbitrary policy that lines the pockets of corporations, so I think it's really important that awareness be spread and to get these folks on the record with their perspective.
And Gabriella, how about you? What would you like to ask?
I would ask if he does that $5.3 million per day are spent on immigrant detention in this country, and that we need to stop the bed quota and mandatory detention and look for ways to have just and humane immigration reform, and ask if he will support those so that we can stop detaining and deporting immigrant families.
I hope Nancy can hold on to his hand while she can get all three of these questions out while she's shaking it. We have another question from John in Oakland. What do you see as the relationship between these lockups for immigrants and the ongoing drug war that is locking up so many people in the U.S.? What do you think, Gabrielle?
Well, I think that's a really important connection. In the 80s and 90s, we saw our prison population skyrocket because of the war on drugs, and we saw it, as we all know, disproportionately affect communities of color, even though drug use is equalized across all communities. And we now are seeing the attack on immigrants and the incarceration of immigrants at these high rates as very profitable. And we see the connection with the drug laws because, again, a lot of the felony convictions for which people are now being that they had years ago or currently have and are being brought into the system and then being put into second punishments through deportation are because of those drug laws. So we need to look at these together, that this is part of our mass incarceration in this country and how corporations are profiting off of this and criminalizing activities that are creating, again, issues of lining corporate pockets. And so I think looking at these two issues together and working across lines to fight incarceration, whether it be for profit or not, is important.
Gabriella, let's circle back to the labor that these immigrants who are detained are providing, because there's some direct connections there along with the drug war. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we know that prison labor, you know, we had an end of slavery, and then we had folks brought into prisons and engaging in labor, and we've seen a long history in this country of the utilization of prison labor to perform perform jobs at very minimal pay. Currently at the GEO Detention Center here in Aurora, there is a lawsuit against the GEO Corporation because they pay inmates $1 a day for working in the facility, and in fact maintain and run it through that labor. And people do things ranging from landscaping to cleaning the bathrooms to serving food to even some clerical work, and again get paid $1 a day. And this is a class action lawsuit to require that folks are paid at least the minimum wage and get back pay, and to stop this kind of exploitations. There also, although, are cases in the GEO detention facility we hear where people are just actually do work for treats in the commissary. And I think
wait. They're working for treats like dogs?
So yeah, they're basic treats. They're working for things like toothpaste and soap. A tube of toothpaste will cost $3.50. If you're working, it'll take you basically 4 days to pay for it. If you are given that for, you may be given something from the commissary. For example, the conditions in the detention center are kept very cold, and there are lots of upper respiratory problems, and inmates can buy a shirt for around $8 in the commissary.
Gee, you have to shake your head. We have a question about how we can research the presence of these facilities in our communities, and we have a link for that. Again, knowledge is power, and a lot of times that's the real issue, isn't it? That's one question. Another question we have from Jonas is, what will it take to get rid of the bed quotas? I'm going to ask Leah to tackle that one.
Sure, it's a great question, and I'd like to give a little bit of background in terms of what is the bed quota. First of all, for those that aren't familiar with it, I'll be quick, I promise. So basically, the bed quota is a federal policy that appears in the appropriations bills that requires that 34,000 beds be maintained within immigration detention. So it first appeared in a congressional federal appropriations, or budget for those that aren't wonky, bill in 2009. The DHS budget in brief, which is essentially an explanation of DHS expenses in FY15, included the quota but lowered it a little bit to 30,539. But what is most encouraging, and speaks to our viewer's question, is that two representatives, Representative Deutsch and Representative Foster, have teamed up to create amendments to the federal budget bills that would strike the language of that created the bed quota. So in June 2013, they put forward an amendment. It got a lot of support. 190 representatives supported it,
Wow.
including 8 Republicans. And right now they're planning on reintroducing it or offering it up on the floor for this year's federal budget negotiation. And we'll post a link, but we'd love if all of you would sign a petition that sends a message to your representative demanding that they support an end to the bed quota. So we'll share that.
Yeah, that petition is on afsc.org. Thank you for answering the question that came in from Gonzalo, but more importantly, here's a comment from Tori Brown. The Death Yards report is amazing, as is the Treatment Industrial Complex report. Thanks so much, AFSC Arizona, for all their good work. Take a bow, Matt.
Well, my colleagues here in Arizona are really the ones who get credit for that, but thank you. I'm glad. And just to say a little bit about the Treatment Industrial Complex report, that's our latest report, and it's about the inroads that the for-profit private prison industry is making with regard to things such as probation, treatment, and mental health care, and they're trying to privatize those practices as well. So as states and federal government are looking at maybe alternatives to incarceration, the private prison industry is looking about how they can make money off of those things as well and keep their fingers in the cookie jar as they consider the criminal justice system for themselves to make money off of.
I got you. We have another question. Are states turning away from for-profit prisons? Gabriella, Leah, Matt, what do you see out there?
I can take a jab at that. Yes, I mean, I think the answer is yes. I think that's why you see politicians both on the left and the right talking about sentencing reform, talking about limiting the amount of people that we're putting in prison. It's a big ship and it's a slow turn, but they are looking at these alternatives, and as incarceration rates across the country start to slow, Arizona, of course, is not doing that, but other states are. This is a moment that's ripe politically and socially for us to really cement this decision to incarcerate less and to criminalize less.
Very good point.
I'd love to jump in if okay.
Please. please.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that one of our amazing allies, Grassroots Leadership, does a lot of site fights when it comes to private prisons or private detention facilities that are being proposed in a particular area. So we can make their website available, and they have some additional information about that. But it's really encouraging to see grassroots activists come out and show their support for ending reliance on private prisons.
We have a question from Rosario. Do you have any information about Frederick, Maryland? How many people were detained through 2014, or where can I get this info? I believe we have a link for resources for facilities locations that's on the chat, and I understand the Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement website also might have that information. I'm interested in what came up in an earlier question, what has to do with sort of the ugly history of incarceration using prisoners for labor. Academics and advocates alike have said that this is a historic trend that actually stems from Jim Crow, when black prisoners were contracted out, often to the same plantations that they had been liberated from. Advocates like Michelle Alexander and academics are saying it is no accident that brown and Spanish-speaking people are bearing the brunt of this bed quota again today. Your thoughts on that, Leah, and then I'll ask Gabriella and Matt.
Sure. I think a lot of it has to do with fear. We hear a lot of rhetoric about these people are going to change our country, or these people are taking over. And at least in some of the reading that I've done about the history of slavery and its relationship to capitalism, those same sentiments were very strong back in those times, and clearly we're seeing it now. So I think there's a lot of xenophobia going around and othering of folks in our communities. And it's very similar. I see a strong parallel with slavery in that throughout the whole pipeline, people are profiting. So in slavery, they steal folks from their communities in Africa. The folks that run the ships that brought the slaves to the U.S., they got a cut. The middlemen that sold the slaves got a cut. The landowners are making money off of them. And we see something similar here, right? That folks' liberty is being taken away in order to line the pockets of private entities.
I'm going to switch gears over to Gabriella. Gabriella, we have a question from Darcy. Are there any ways to volunteer or visit with people who are held in these facilities in order to support them?
So here in Colorado, we have a group that AFSC help support called Casa de Paz, and that's exactly what they do. They have people contact them, and they send in visitors. If you're in Colorado, I can share that with you. But there are other organizations in other states. I do not have all of the information, but if you were to reach out to me, we can dig that up. It is often really important to have people visiting. We know that incarceration, having folks visit is important in general, and especially in detention centers where people have family who are undocumented, they can't visit them, and often they're very far away. So checking in and see, we also have a group here in Colorado, Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, seeing if you have something similar there where you get names of people who want to have visitors, because you don't want to take up space for people who do have family to visit them, to visit and see what kinds of needs they have, and really kind of bear witness and accompany them in that process.
Let's talk about another aspect of this whole insane, I use the word advisedly, immigration policy, which has to do with the people who are forced to have mixed status families and wind up every day being afraid that somebody somewhere is going to decide that they don't deserve to be in a community with their family because their status is different from another family member's. Leah, do we have any clarifications from anyone in the government about changing this situation? People have talked a lot about the deferred action or executive order by the president. What's that really look like on the ground?
Sure. Well, I'd love to also hear from Gabriella, since she's much more in touch with folks in individual communities versus me that's stuck in the Beltway, and here's a lot of political rhetoric. So yeah, so basically the president's executive action if it does go forward, which we think it will, but given the court cases, a little bit of a caveat, it will benefit some folks, so some eligible undocumented immigrant youth under the DACA program, and then some parents of undocumented youth under a program called DAPA. And so it's a good step in the right direction, but there are many, many, many people that will not benefit from this. And so I think we're going to continue to see mixed status families, which again has very serious psychological repercussions for these folks. Mm-hmm. Gabriella, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know that over 70% of all immigrant families have people of mixed status. So this this misconception that we can just take folks who are undocumented and take them out of this country is problematic in and of itself, but it's also not realistic in family structures. And it has devastating impacts. And so the families that we're working with, I talked about the negative impacts and the trauma, but one of the things that's been so powerful for me is to see the strength and determination that people have and how they're fighting their own cases, and people come to our vigils that we hold monthly in front of the Geo Detention Center. We've been doing that for 6 years, and they come, and many of them actually were incarcerated in there, and they come out and they speak out with incredible courage because they want to stop this so that other families don't go through this. And we're fighting for just and humane reform that allows folks who are in this country, part of our communities, to legalize their status, that we end the guest worker program, that we protect the rights of all workers, that we end border militarization that is creating incredible trauma of people crossing the borders.
Would you talk a little bit about Arturo, the gentleman in Sanctuary, and how his family structure reflects this crazy mixed up system we're working with?
So Arturo and his wife Ana came over 15 years ago. They have family who have status in this country, and they came for a visit and decided to stay with their 3-month-old daughter. So they have a 15-year-old daughter who is now applying for DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So she will be getting status. It's not a permanent status. It's a temporary status. Their daughter, Andrea, who is 9, is a citizen. And then Ana and Arturo is in deportation proceedings because he was wrongfully charged of a crime on his work site, where he was actually the person who lied about what had happened. And he was found completely innocent, but he served 45 days in jail and in immigrant detention. And so his family, they have actually been applying for legal status through Ana, his wife's father, and through his father-in-law, but they have been waiting for over a decade and still have at least another decade in that line. So they actually have a line to get into, but that line is so long that it's not realistic. And there's so many people in this country who don't have a line to get into. And so this issue of mixed family status is huge, and that's why we need reform that really looks at the unification of family and looks at the fact that people who have been part of our community for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, they don't have access to gain status, and it has huge detriments on our community.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have another question. What about the family detention centers that are being erected around the country? That, excuse me, for those who might not remember, last summer, undocumented children fleeing violence south of the border came up to the U.S., and as a response, family detention centers were erected around the country by the federal government. Leah, do you want to chime in a bit on that?
Sure, I can say a little bit. That's correct. There are family detention facilities. Most of them have been built in the border region. And as Gabriella mentioned earlier, when it comes to immigrant detention, there are prison-like conditions, and that's very much true in these facilities as well. So we're seeing a lot of kids that are exhibiting indications of stress. The food is completely inadequate. There's very little access to outside. Like it's pretty bad in there. There's been allegations of sexual assault happening, and it is worthy of noting that those family detention centers operating along the border are privately operated.
There's another question. Where can we get good information on these companies and their CEOs? I think Matt has a link that he's sharing with folks, or can share with them. What is that link there, Matt?
So one really great report was put out by Grassroots Leadership, who was referenced earlier, and they're great colleagues that we have out of Austin, Texas, and they did a report in honor of Corrections Corporation of America's 30th anniversary, and it's called the CCA Dirty 30. You can find that report at their website, and that has a lot of information about the company itself, on top of just the money. Finding money is hard, and how much everybody gets. That's the nature of being a private company. Sometimes you don't have to share all that information. But then there's also there's other resources on Grassroots Leadership's website. Plus, our report again. Private prisons, the public's problem, is another good resource.
Yeah, I'd like to toot our horn a little bit, Matt. I know you're modest, but the Arizona report on private prisons and how much they cost the public is a classic example of why the locking people up for profit is something we ought to think twice about. Leah, you have any more information about the lack of transparency that a lot of these companies running prisons and detention centers enjoy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and thanks to Matt for highlighting it. So recently, our friends at the ACLU National Prison Project released a report that in part discusses the lack of transparency in private facilities. So in essence, private companies aren't required to comply with the Freedom of Information Act, which is often called FOIA, and often exempted from state open records laws. And those laws are designed to provide transparency, independent evaluation of what's going on within those facilities, ensure compliance with policies, all good things. So it's worrisome that they're able to dodge this, and it's interesting when you hear from these companies when FOIA requests are filed with them, or when community members seek information from them about the different facilities and their operations. Many times they cite a FOIA exception, which is trade secret or proprietary information, and essentially that tagline, which suggests that the information that is being sought would interrupt their business operations or would give away secrets that they hold within their business, and it would thwart their economic viability. So they cite these, and it's kind of funny if you look at some of the examples where they've cited trade secrets or proprietary information. These include earnings that they make from government contracts, policies pertaining to segregated housing and medical care, staffing models, staff training modules, policies protecting residents' legal rights, documents demonstrating compliance with performance standards, which are, it's called the Performance-Based National Detention Standards, which hasn't been fully implemented in all detention facilities, which is another issue. But one of the big things that I think advocates should do and are doing is drawing attention to the fact that these companies can dodge transparency efforts.
And let's be clear, lack of transparency doesn't just impact on what's happening to people imprisoned. It is a lack of transparency about what happens to the people who work there as well. Mm-hmm. The status of those who work for a lot of these companies is endangered because they're not trained well. They're not given the tools they need. But before we go ahead, let's go back to a question that arose earlier that I didn't get a chance to get to. There is something called an asylum process in the United States, and their question is, what do we know about that and how it does or does not play out with immigrants? I'm going to ask Gabriella to answer that one.
I want to actually connect that connection to the family detention centers. When we had all of these young folks who actually were called unaccompanied minors, but many of them were coming with their mothers or had family here, so they were not fully unaccompanied, but they were coming and seeking asylum often because of violence in their own countries, which the U.S. has played a historic role in the wars in the 80s and our continued support for governments that do not support the people. And so what has happened is people are actually following the asylum process. To seek asylum in this country, you must come to this country and then ask for asylum. And that is the actual process. And then it is a long process of proving credible. You first have to pass a credible fear interview and then go through a series of processes. But what we're seeing happen with these family detention centers is that corporations are profiting off of incarcerating them in very horrific conditions, where lawyers who have been down to visit and help out there find that people can't even, part of the process is to share the story and pass a credible fear. But if your child who was there, who is in the room with you while you're trying to share a story of being raped or being held at gunpoint, where you don't want to re-traumatize your child, you're actually not going to be able to go through the process fully. People could easily go through the asylum process without being incarcerated, and that is actually what should be happening. And so these, again, profiting off of incarcerating families and incarcerating people in general is very problematic and disrupts the actual asylum process.
Not to mention the fact we're talking about children here. Let's remember, these are children. It is interesting, too, one of the questions is about the revolving door that seems to be happening among elected officials and boards of directors. Because we are talking about for-profit prison companies, it would be interesting to find out if there's some specific examples. I think Matt talked about an example of that earlier, where a state official wound up changing sides, so to speak.
Well, he stepped down from the board. That was former U.S. Senator Dennis DeConcini, and I think that the person brings up a really important question in terms of the crossover between our political processes and the private interests of people making money off of mass incarceration, and you know that is very evident here in Arizona. Both our current governor Ducey and our past governor Brewer had on their cabinets and their advisors people who were former lobbyists for Corrections Corporation of America, and it's no wonder that we're continuing to sign contracts and build new private prisons here in Arizona, where it very much has a strong foothold in the state in terms of the private prison industry. And so while I'm not as familiar with the federal level of politicians and their participation in some of these companies, I can only imagine that it also exists there, and I think we've seen that in the past.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, governing under the influence is becoming quite prolific around our country and the systems that run our country. And our project, Governing Under the Influence, is going to be releasing a white paper on the revolving door issue soon enough. We have another question. Is there a similar trend of limiting the proliferation of criminal alien requirement prisons as there are with private immigrant detentions? I'm not familiar with this. The other part of the question is, are CAR prisons, criminal alien requirement prisons, both for men and women? I believe we might have, Leah, you might have an answer for this, or at least a background explanation here.
Sure, I do. Yeah, and I'm hoping we can share with you a link that I just sent to my colleagues here. The ACLU National Prison Project, which I mentioned earlier when it comes to transparency issues, their new report deals only with looking at these CAR facilities and looking at the relationship with private prison companies. So it's an amazing resource, so I really encourage you to read it. I do think that there's a similar dynamic when it comes to CAR prisons as we see with immigration detention facilities and private prison companies attempting to wield influence on policies that would fuel their bottom line. I know, for example, there are new requests for proposals coming out for additional CAR facilities, but it's very difficult to get additional information about them. So I think the best resource would be to go to that report. And speaking to the gender issue, I'm not sure. It's a good question in terms of if both men and women are held in CAR facilities. So if you find out, let us know.
That's why the internet's so wonderful. AFSC.org is our website for information about the office in Washington, the office in Denver, and the office in Tucson. We have another question. Do we know anything about the Family Detention Center in Berks County, Pennsylvania? I believe the link that was passed on earlier with the locations of these facilities might be able to help you. If my colleague will repost that link, it would be great. Let me shift gears just a little bit here. Obviously, this is a huge issue. It is implications in many, many parts of our society. So what advice would you give people? What can people do to change this policy? Leah, let's start with you.
Sure. So I would encourage people to engage in the democratic process. Don't just sit by and watch bad policies happen and kind of hold your head down as a result. Take action. You're welcome to take our online action. Educate yourself about these policies. Tell your friends, and stay in contact with your members of Congress, both your representative and your senators, because they really have the power to address this issue because it does come up in appropriations language, the bed quota. So I think it's a combination of engaging with members of Congress, education, and sharing your knowledge.
Okay, Gabriella, what can people do to get this policy changed?
I think the things Leah said are really important, and then I would also really encourage people, if they're part of a faith community or part of a community group, to get involved. And Ralph, we're going to share a resource, Engaging Your Faith Community on Immigration, First Steps in Organizing and Action by Small Groups in Religious Settings. I think faith communities have a really important role in speaking about the moral, really the moral stain on our country at this moment through our immigration policy and profiteering off of destroying families. And so I think, again, part of that is educating yourself. I'll share a link on our, we have a whole resource on learning about different topics, and then understanding your own privilege and what it is to be an ally. I will share those resources also, is really important, because we need to change the policies, and we need to have just and humane reform, and we've been very far from that. At the federal level, we've had some strides made at state levels, but we have to work at all of these levels, and in order to do that, we need to be having discussions at our dinner tables. And so I can also share a resource on how to engage with your aunt and uncle at the holiday table on the issue.
Matt, how about you? What kind of grassroots pick up your feet and or your pen and or your telephone can people do to end this policy?
Well, I think both Leah and Gabriella hit on some really important points, and I'll just talk about something different rather than reiterate everything they said. Here in Tucson, there's a very big movement to try and close the practice of Operation Streamline, which is criminalizing immigrants and sending them to prison and then eventually deporting them. There was a group of people who decided that it just needed to stop, and we've been working for a couple years now to try and stop it, and we've raised awareness and we've educated people. But this group of community members stopped the buses that were transporting the people who were going to go through Operation Streamline, and those 70 individuals didn't make it to court that day, and didn't get a criminal record, and didn't go to a federal detention facility. So I think all forms of political participation need to be on the table in terms of what it is that we as a community and we as allies and partners are really willing to think about when it comes to stopping people from being deported and criminalized.
I might mention everybody has a smartphone with a camera on it these days, so that might be another tool that people can find a way to use. We are going to be posting a bunch of the resources that Gabriella just mentioned, but let me remind you that on afsc.org is a petition that we'd love you to sign to end the bed quota amendment, which is in the upcoming federal budget cycle. We know that people organizing against this kind of policy often gets caught up in what Leah mentioned, which is fear. which is another reason why I want to encourage people to think about this in the context of faith. One of the things that I've been impressed with the sanctuary movement, which I'm going to ask Gabriella to talk about a little bit, is the interfaith nature of the effort. Can you describe that a little bit, Gabriella?
Yes, so the sanctuary movement takes its roots, the current sanctuary movement, from the sanctuary movement in the 1980s when people were fleeing Central America. But now it differs in that sanctuary is actually providing long-term support. I would say that sanctuary embodies the integrity of our faith traditions to proclaim and protect the dignity and worth of every human being. Providing sanctuary, which means a place for someone to live and stay and be supported both physically and spiritually, affirms our solidarity with the immigrant sisters and brothers and their prophetic voice by accompanying their resistance to their deportation while providing a safe space for their body and spirit. And so it is a spiritual practice and also an act of resistance and a way of not only supporting that individual, but that individual is making a huge sacrifice, such as Arturo, in going into sanctuary, in that he is limiting his freedom in order to fight his case and bring light to this issue to change policy as a whole.
Excellent point. I might point out that we have immigrant rights programs around the United States. They are fighting on different fronts, but the policy of locking people up for profit in immigrant detention centers touches all the work that we're engaged in, from getting driver's licenses for people in Iowa to helping the young people under deferred action get to college. We are trying to lift up the fact that these are families, these are children, these are human beings, all of whom deserve the right to be respected. Getting another message here. Okay, time is pressing on. I can't believe it. It's been a fast hour. I will move on to Leah at this point. Leah, can you give us your final thoughts on why this issue matters to people who probably have never seen an immigrant detention center in their lives?
It's a really great question, and my response is very similar to what we've been discussing in terms of recognizing each other's humanity. We're all brothers and sisters in our communities. It's not me versus them or Group X versus Group Y. If we look out for all of us, we'll all benefit. And everybody has the right to dignity, and these practices really shame our entire society. It's a stain on who we are, who we want to be. So I would just encourage people to remember that we're all in this together.
Okay, and Matt, why should I care about immigrant detention centers wherever they are when I don't actually have to see them every day? I don't know about Operation Streamline because it's not on television.
The reason that you should care is because you care about not separating families, and that's what criminalization practices, that's what detention and deportation do. They're separating families, and this these are families who have been here for years, or people who are simply coming to be with family members or coming to work on behalf of their family. And when we throw people in prison, throw people in detention, and then deport them with criminal records, that is separating families, and nobody wants to separate families. We all want families to be together. We want children to be with their parents. We want parents to be able to provide for their children, and on and on and on. That's why we should care about this.
And that's a reminder that no human being is illegal, which is one of the reasons why undocumented immigrants is the phrase we use at AFSC, and that, by the way, the Associated Press now uses along with New York Times. Gabriella, final thoughts?
Yes. For me, this is also about what could be the potential of our communities. I want you to think about the stories I shared with you about Lupe, Felipe, and Arturo. And I see the energy, the amount of resources, the emotional drain that fighting their cases and all the work they do in fighting other people's cases and working to change the policies to try to stop deportation and detention. And I think about, what if all of that incredible energy and resources they're using were to go to other social justice issues? If they were not tied up in fighting and resisting a system that is lining the pockets of corporations, destroying families, and hurting our communities in addition to our economy? What kind of communities, families, society, and world would we have? And I want us to have that option of having a really strong community and society, and that's why we need to end detention and deportation and have just and humane immigration reform.
I love that answer. Thank you. To remind you, for more on our work about immigration, please visit afsc.org. Also visit afsc.org to sign the petition to end this amendment that enforces a bed quota in the upcoming federal budget cycle. If you're curious about more corporate influence on public policy, please visit gui.afsc.org. That's Governing Under the Influence. I want to thank our experts, Gabriela Flora. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm so glad all of you could join us across the country.
And Leah Lindsay in Washington.
Yes, thank you for sharing your time with us.
And Matt Lowen in Arizona.
Always happy to be here. Thanks.
We will be posting clips from this hangout later on. Please check afsc.org. This has been Locked Up for Profit. I'm Alexis Moore. Thanks for coming.